Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Academy of Ideas Education Forum. My name is Toby Marshall, and I'm an A-level film studies teacher, and I work within the state sector, and I'll be your chair tonight. The issue we have assembled to discuss is the future of the Office for Standards in Education, or Ofsted. And I won't say a great deal by way of introduction, as we have four great speakers with us tonight to prompt us to think and discuss this issue. But what I will say is that there's a strong and I believe a growing perception that the Inspectorate is currently focusing far too much on contentious moral and political themes and not enough on matters related to knowledge and education. Naturally, as a state school teacher or state sector teacher, I have my own views on this matter, but I will expect that today, in the interest of balance, I'll be playing the role of devil's advocate, or maybe the inspector's advocate in our discussion. So our panelists, which will speak in the order in which I'm about to introduce them, are going to introduce for between 5 and 7 minutes. But then my intention is to go out straight to discussion from the audience and comments. So just be thinking about your points and questions as our panelists are speaking. And I strongly believe that education belongs to everyone. It's everybody's education and everyone's got a right to speak on it. It's not the property of one particular group in society or one particular ideology. It belongs to us all. So we want to get a range of views on this. After about 2 or 3 rounds of discussions, I'll ask our speakers to come back and to conclude in reversed order. So speaking first, we have Neil Davenport. Neil is a writer and a teacher. And it was Neil's comments on Facebook that first inspired this session. I thought he was saying some very interesting things on Facebook about Ofsted, and I thought it was important that we hammer some of these issues out following those comments. Then we're going to have Joseph Robertson, and Joseph is the director of the Orthodox Conservatives think tank and an education research fellow at the Bow Group. Following this, we're going to have Rowenna Davis. Rowenna is a teacher, a former journalist, and Labour Party parliamentary candidate, and a new mum. Congratulations, Rowenna, well done. And then finally, we're going to have Alex Kenny. And Alex is a secondary school teacher and an NEU Executive member. So I'm really pleased that everyone's agreed to speak. I think we've got a good range of perspectives there on the panel. Just before we start, I just want to remind everyone that we are recording tonight for the benefit of people who can't make this time. And as has been pointed out by Alex, we're competing with Boris Johnson at this very moment. He's doing a press conference, but who needs him? Neil, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so on the Academy of Ideas website, there is a mention that we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the creation of Ofsted. Now, obviously, standards inspectors within state education has existed for a long, long time. It's not necessarily a new thing, but I think the 30th anniversary of Ofsted in terms of its approach is actually quite a significant moment, because I think this was the beginning of perhaps the reorganisation of state institutions and wider society. I think in particular the demise of Labourism, the demise of the Labour Party as a mediating bridge between elite interests and the working classes was pretty much over by sort of 92 and 1993. And I think state education has increasingly been relied upon as a mediator of elite ideas at any given time, really. And I think for that reason, Ofsted has always been political, even though its approach has been on monitoring, teaching, and learning. But even on things like inspecting the quality of teaching and learning can be political. So I'll give an example. In the 2000s, a lot of Ofsted's frameworks was based on an instrumental approach to learning and the devaluing of academic content, which in itself was political regarding the shift towards presentism of New Labour, even if that wasn't always readily apparent. But I think the difference in very recent years, the explicit and non-subtle moral directives that Ofsted are enforcing on state schools, I think it reflects the broader cranking up and intensification of identity politics as a way of creating new moral purposes for wider state institutions, and perhaps with the purpose of disciplining the mass of society as a whole. And a lot of the comments I want to raise this evening, it's similar to some of the discussions we were having on the NEU Elites meeting back in November. And I think consequently, the inspection of teaching and learning is increasingly becoming second place towards judging whether state schools are compliant with a whole range of moral instructions that have actually come from the civil service. And I think in particular, it is this area where there's a massive gulf between an ostensibly anti-woke government with a deeply woke state enforcing many of these issues. I mean, it's just to give you a couple of examples, I think once state schools were out of lockdown, Ofsted guidelines were pretty much more concerned about issues related to combating homophobia and transphobia, as well as sort of Me Too related issues on sexual harassment, and that was seen as more pressing than the quality of teaching and learning. And to give you an example, a school in Colchester, which despite having excellent teaching and learning and excellent results, was put into special measures due to these broader kind of moral questions, rather than based on exam results. I think some of these responses, particularly on combating homophobia, have roots in the Trojan horse scandal back in 2014. I think there was a panic that religious extremism was taking grip in Muslim majority schools, whilst this also tipped into looking at Jewish schools, particularly I think the quasi-homeschooling that you get in Hasidic communities, and as well as some Catholic schools as well. I think these responses are often justified by the 2010 Equality Act and juggling sort of various protected characteristics. Nevertheless, I think social conservatism of Islam didn't exactly fall into that. And I think this is why Ofsted started insisting on the teaching of British values in state schools, campaigns against FGM, and looking out for signs of extremism. But having said that, I would express a little bit of caution as to whether it's all sort of just aimed at the Muslim community, because I think some of the materials on combating extremism recommended by Ofsted actually refuse to mention Islamic terrorism by name, which perhaps indicates how the overriding mission to combat Islamic extremism is not really top of the agenda here. I think what's not mentioned, though, is that after Brexit, some educationalists were pondering whether expressions of support for leaving the European Union could be classified as a form of political extremism, and therefore sort of policed in secondary schools. A questionnaire that was sent around by universities on teaching content in sixth forms slipped in Brexit as a dangerous ideology. I think subsequently this has been dropped explicitly, because I think it's quite a hard thing to make stick. But nevertheless, I think the cranking up of woke values within state education has become a galvanizing mechanism against what they think Brexit represents. And it's a point that Claire Fox made very well, actually, in the November conference. Finally, I think the other issue with Ofsted is the catch-all word of safeguarding, which I think anyone who works in secondary schools will sort of come over time and time again. Now, obviously, protectors are wrong with protecting children. Education sector has always ensured that children are sort of protected and they kind of look out for any harm. But I think what is happening with this word of safeguarding is that it's become pretty much a blank check to write anything that the state believes poses risk or harm to children, which often translates to snooping on a child's home life. And again, Ofsted can downgrade secondary schools if they feel they're not encouraging children to report wellbeing and safety issues to teachers. And I think in this respect, the SNP's Named Persons Act, which is the idea that education in other state sectors become a state guardian for all children, is steadily being introduced through the back door by way of threatening schools with special measures, grading if they actually sort of don't comply with this demand that children should be encouraged to report on anything that goes on at home. Okay, so I just want to sort of summarise what I've said, and there's plenty more we can discuss during the course of the evening, but I think Ofsted has always been political, ensuring that the ideological needs of the ruling elite can be transmitted into state schools at any given time. And I think it was created once earlier mediators of elite rule collapsed in the post-Cold War era. But I think the key difference today is that Ofsted are a key institution that is enforcing new elite authoritarianism with a more explicit moral agenda than previously. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Neil. There's lots of it for us to think about there. Joseph.
Yes, thanks, Toby. So the question that I really want to propose is the way Ofsted operates today really a natural part of our democracy? And is education still part of our democratic process? A phrase I like to use now, considering the circumstances we're in, is, are we actually in a pandemic of critical thought? And is that something that we really need to consider going forward? Someone recently said to me that there's no new cultural movements, only political ones. And I think that's very much a danger in our educational system. And of course, as Neil was saying, Ofsted grew from a long history of educational watchdogs. Grew into the late 90s from really being concerned with sort of school inspections to discerning criteria for adoption, higher education, gaining power of entry in schools, and these powers included surveillance and more. So it's quite a comprehensive list of powers that it has. And when a non-ministerial body and a fairly independently operating body, looking at every area of young people's services, grows to gain such control and such power, absolute impartiality must be the bare minimum expected from parents. And the question as to why an independent organisation has such power is desperately in need of answering at a political level, as well as a detailed independent review of how it operates in practice, which I think is something that simply hasn't been forthcoming. It's funded, of course, by the taxpayer, but with a limited layer of accountability. And perhaps the question tonight, aside from its politicisation of a certain worldview and a certain moral output, should be a question mark on its lack of critical input from elected politicians in Parliament. It sends an annual report to the Education Select Committee, but this is often met with little scrutiny. Questions fired back are often brief or top line, and there's very little endeavour to publicly criticise the organisation, other than occasionally from media pieces. So such a review process, in my opinion, doesn't work because MPs simply don't have time to dive deep into the ethos surrounding Ofsted. But what could matter more than the education of the children of this country and the standards of freedom and safety that should be upheld in every learning environment, regardless of belief or background? So I wanted to quickly quote from Policy Exchange 2020 report on the Watchman Revisited, which took an overview look at the way that Ofsted operates. It's quite brief, and it says, faith schools play an important role in meeting the basic rights expressed under Article 2 of the Protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, enshrined in UK law via the Human Rights Act, which states, no person shall be denied the right to education. In the exercise of any functions which it assumes in relation to education and to teaching, the state shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions. However, Amanda Spielman, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education and Children's Services and Skills, currently re-elected to serve a second term in charge of Ofsted, stated at an address to Stonewall, we want Ofsted to have a muscular liberalism. And this seems to be a paradox. It seems to be at odds with the ability to ensure that parents can teach their children a particular religious and philosophical conviction. So fundamentally, we have to assume that Spielman believes that the nature of the state has changed, so that schools should teach what the state, or rather Ofsted in this case, want, and not necessarily what parents want. And again, to reaffirm this assertion of Ofsted's new and self-promoted mission, Spielman stated, "Through our inspections of education and social care, Ofsted is also the main checking mechanism for the Equality Act, itself now nearly a decade old, which is part of the valuable framework of law and policy that provides for all children to be educated for life in modern Britain." Well, this sets Ofsted on quite a different trajectory, and therefore makes it not merely an educational authority, but also a self-appointed moral and apparently judicial authority. And therefore we have to look at where Ofsted aligns its internal views, as this no doubt will influence the next generation of children's minds in a way that cannot be altered. And despite breaking membership links with the disgraced organisation in the last year or two, Ofsted's inspectors have been trained by Stonewall, participated in their conferences, and as the Telegraph reported as late as June last year, Stonewall lobbying, raising concerns with Ofsted still continue frequently. So this is another concern that we have to address. Alongside this, it's apparent that Ofsted is pursuing a secularist agenda, which believes that educational methods have to be in accordance with a particular educational philosophy. So again, this would seem to not be quite in line with the Self-Same Equalities Act that they purport to promote. For schools, being failed by Ofsted means that they will have funding cut and effectively be taken over. And therefore, is it any wonder that in deference to such authority, schools must allow themselves to promote the ideologies which Ofsted aligns with? And I believe that this culture of fear has led to multiple teachers saying their day-to-day stress is increased. They now have an inability to teach children as they see fit. And I guess the question for us as the public must be, is this now a healthy environment for pupils and for teachers? And is it conducive to bringing forward teachers with new ideas, enthusiasm, and interests in the welfare of children, or simply teachers who want to tick boxes? And I think we're in danger of creating an educational body of automatons who are simply following state legislation rather than pursuing critical thought. And another question I want to raise is the focus really on performance, or is this new wave of Ofsted power simply an attempt to realign culture, religion, and social conditioning as best as it sees fit, moulding the minds and worldview of the next generations with no concern for family or cultural choices? One example of this is in Jewish faith schools, where despite meeting grade standards, there's been several failures or downgradings based on them not meeting the needs in Ofsted's eyes of the Equality Act. Ofsted school reports very often at the end of briefs, taking an inordinate amount of time to talk about the Equalities Act in comparison to their inspection of educational standards, which of course is their primary role. So this is another concern. Are they actually looking at performance, or are they looking at ideology? And therefore we have to ask, can a body be truly impartial in such circumstances? And according to one court case already, I believe the answer is no. After being failed, Al-Hijra Muslim school went to court with the appeal that Ofsted had visited the school already, determining that they would fail them. And when this went to oral case review, the allegation was dropped, but not before the judge had agreed that he thought there was an element of impartiality. One other area, obviously, which I'm sure we'll touch on, is to do with early age teaching of sexuality and relationships. And with the pursuance of an Ofsted ideology that seemingly wants to promote early age concerns regarding sexuality, it's perhaps worth considering the Secretary of State's forward to the government's relationship education, relationships and sex education and health education guidance, in which it was propounded that sex education must be taught sensitively and inclusively with respect to the backgrounds and beliefs of pupils. So once again, we must ask, is the politicization of Ofsted's agenda truly run by the politicians? Or is its independence and lack of accountability a backdoor for more sinister and uncontrollable ideology? In a similar vein, Ofsted also likes to flex its muscle in teaching practices, and we can particularly see this in the teaching phonics, where following a statement from the Minister for Education, Michael Gove, suggesting preference for a particular framework of learning, Ofsted proceeded to incorporate that mandate into their framework of inspection. So I guess the final question is, can we democratize Ofsted? Does it need to be completely overhauled? Or can an independent body truly sort of root out the weeds from this organization? Can it change its tack now, or are we too late in the day to save it? And my answer to that would probably be no.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joseph. Rowenna.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rowenna, not Rowena, Chair.
Rowenna.
It's a
Sorry,
thing.
apologies.
No, don't worry. It happens my whole life. It's really interesting listening to the previous two speakers because I've got a slightly different experience and a slightly different take on what's happening. A lot of what I'm going to say tonight is based on that personal experience as a teacher, which I think is useful, but obviously has its limits in that it doesn't speak for everyone's experience in schools. I've taught for half a decade. I've taught in a state secondary school in a challenging part of Southampton and also here where I live in Croydon. And I joined teaching slightly later in my career and joined it with a lot of idealism and energy. And I absolutely loved the kids and did a lot of debating, as we know about with the Institute of Ideas. But I found the system was too rigid and narrowing, which is, I think, some of the concerns we've been talking about tonight, but less because of Ofsted, but more because of an obsessive focus on exams and a real lack of resources. And I really think that that was the root of the problems that I was facing as a teacher, and meant that when I had my little girl a year ago, I stopped. I felt like it wasn't compatible to be a mum and to be a state school teacher. And actually, I didn't recognize the things that perhaps Neil was talking about at the beginning about during lockdown when I was teaching still, an obsessive focus on transphobia or homophobia. In fact, we did nothing on that. And when the Me Too movement came about, if anything, I felt like it was a bit of a wake-up call because I'd never taught any sex education in my 5 years of teaching, and it was never there for children. And I felt that was really letting them down and quite a failure. So I kind of welcomed that debate opening up in classrooms. Similarly, in terms of safeguarding, I never felt that that was like an intrusion into children's lives or family lives at all. Far from it. We never had the resources to follow up really serious concerns that should have actually been followed up earlier. So it's a slightly different perspective there. And when it came to Ofsted in particular, I found that it was a kind of a distant spectra. It was less too political and more just something stressful for teachers, this thing that might descend on them at any time and pass judgment without really any rootedness or connection or understanding to the challenges that we were facing all the time. And it was that disconnection or lack of understanding from Ofsted that I think we feared mostly as a staff. But on reflection, and I went away and sort of thought about this a little bit more in relation to this topic and Ofsted more broadly, and did a bit of research and thinking. And there were kind of 2 points I wanted to make about Ofsted in general. And the first is that I think that the way we evaluate schools at the moment is too narrow, and that's certainly true. But in the opening of this series, it said perhaps we should just rely on data instead to judge schools. But I think that would result in a massive overfocus on exam results. And that creates really malign incentives, right? If you just look at exam results, you can start getting offloading, you can get kids excluded for poor reasons, you can really narrow the curriculum. And so I think it's incumbent on us, and I think this is what some of the speakers were saying, to perhaps try and reform Ofsted if we think that there's an issue with it, or reclaim it or make it more democratic, but certainly not to get rid of it. Because the alternative, I feel, would be to slip into a position where we overly focus on exams. And we know that there are, year 6 kids that are only ever taught English and maths for an entire year, because that's what's on their exam curriculum, and anything else is blotted out. And actually at the moment, Ofsted is kind of starting to push schools to focus a little bit more on what is being taught and how it's being taught, and trying to make it a bit broader to combat that kind of obsessive exam focus, which I think is welcome. If I had my way on it, I think the way we'd evaluate schools would be even broader again, and that we'd also look a lot more at student voice and at parental voice and what happens to kids after they've left your school. But to just get rid of Ofsted or just write it off, I think, is to deny some of the important balancing acts it has against an obsessive focus on exams. The second point I really wanted to make about Ofsted is that, and this may be controversial, but in some ways, I don't think it's political enough as an institution. Let me explain what I mean. It is quite common for Ofsted to descend on a school and say, for example, that they have a too narrow curriculum. without taking into account the fact that it may be impossible to afford to broaden that curriculum for that particular school. I know that's happened in certain areas. My school couldn't afford to teach domestic science, despite a load of kids wanting it and asking for it, even in an extracurricular way, because there just wasn't the resources there. And yet Ofsted can kind of descend on you from these parachuting heights and tell you that you really should be doing better and that you're failing because you're not doing those things. And actually, I think that Ofsted should be more aware and more honest about the context that our schools are facing, the challenges they're facing socially and economically, in order to pass fair judgment. And I don't want to be naive about that. I understand that Ofsted can't be a campaigning body, but if you look at comparative bodies like the Prisons Inspectorate, particularly under Anne Hours, for example, there was a very clear, honest assessment of the needs of the prison system that were put forward there, as well as an assessment of the individual prisons. And I think that that was actually more helpful. So those, I'm really interested in other people's responses to that, but they would be my two positions: that Ofsted at the moment does play some good role in stopping an obsessive focus and a sole focus on exams. And that secondly, Ofsted should be in a way more politically aware or more politically honest about the genuine pressures that are facing schools, the teachers and our kids.
Thank you very much. Alex.
Yep. Thank you. Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight, and I welcome the contributions from the other panelists. I've agreed with some of what they've said and disagreed with other parts of it, which is great, really healthy for this debate. As others have said, it's a good time to be talking about the role Ofsted plays and the impact that it has. But we should remember, and we shouldn't be surprised if it's overreached, or we shouldn't be surprised if it's becoming the tool by which orthodoxies are imposed on schools, because that is what it was set up to do in 1992, to impose an orthodoxy and a one-size-fits-all model of education on our schools. And I want to start by stating, for the avoidance of doubt, that the NEU is in favour of scrutiny, challenge and accountability in the education system. They're not things education professionals are scared of. In fact, teachers like nothing better than showing off what they're doing. They're all too aware of what they need to improve on and always ready to ask for help or seek advice. So we support an inspection system that is collaborative, fair and proportionate and linked to professional development. Such systems exist elsewhere, but the simple truth is that we're a long way from that in this country, and this debate is so welcome and important. In 2017, the National Audit Office concluded, Ofsted does not know whether its school inspections are having the intended impact to raise the standards of education and improve the quality of children's and young people's lives. Just let that sit there for a minute. The Office for Standards in Education doesn't know whether it's having an impact. So any discussion about Ofsted and accountability in the education system has to take place in the context of a wider discussion about what role education plays in the 21st century and what outcomes we want from our system. But we also have to place this discussion in the context of a huge crisis in teacher recruitment and retention. Prior to the pandemic, the government missed its targets for 8 successive years, recruiting enough teachers to make up for the numbers that are leaving the profession. And we know that 40% of new teachers leave within 5 years of their training, which, if nothing else, is a shocking waste of money. And the reason given for so many teachers leaving the profession early is workload, and particularly the kind of work over which they've no professional control, and sees them constantly having to prove themselves, prove that they're doing something rather than getting on and doing it and developing it even further. And I think Ofsted is one of the reasons for that. It's a problem that Ofsted and the government acknowledge. They acknowledge that workload and well-being are real problems in schools, but they don't have the wit to see that they're the cause of it. And in a bizarre twist, Ofsted are now suggesting that they'll look at what steps schools are taking to reduce workload and improve staff well-being, which is rather like asking the fox to investigate why the chickens are getting restless. So we've had Ofsted for 30 years, and in that time, I would argue that it has had a corrosive effect on teacher professionalism and the relationships within schools and between schools and local authorities. You mention Ofsted to any group of teachers and you can settle down for hours listening to how alienating the experience is, how schools game the system. Let's not go into details, but we've all seen it. And in many cases, how many more they've left before they leave, rather like footballers or athletes see their careers in terms of World Cups or Olympic Games. Ofsted has become part of a fear index in schools, where getting through an inspection or being Ofsted ready has become almost the core purpose of what we do. Decision-making guided because Ofsted is imminent rather than because it's good for children and improves the outcomes. Furthermore, I'd argue that Ofsted has helped perpetuate a system where our schools have become exam factories, our children turned into chunks of color-coded data, and where poverty and social class are still the major determinants of educational outcomes. For all the raising of standards in the last 30 years, the gap between the highest attaining and the lowest attaining is pretty much the same as it was at the start of the big education reforms. Fear of failure has led many schools to play it safe with the curriculum offer, reducing creative and artistic subjects in favour of an increased emphasis on what can be measured. It doesn't have to be this way. The fact that education professionals talk about being Ofsteded in the passive sense is just wrong. Education professionals should not be afraid of inspection and scrutiny, but under the current system, the stakes are too high. Is Ofsted too political? Well, I'd argue that there are numerous times over the years where Ofsted has overstepped its remit as the Office for Standards in Education, and I think it's worse under its current chief. In 2017, Amanda Spielman used a speech to offer her opinions on whether Muslim girls should wear hijabs to schools. She said Ofsted inspectors would speak to young girls wearing the hijab to ask why they're doing it, and that where primary school children are expected to wear the hijab, it could be interpreted as a sexualization of young girls. And she linked this issue to the ongoing discussion about British values. Now, she's entitled to her opinions on this subject. It's one on which opinions are strongly felt and divided. But as the chief of the body responsible for standards in education, she offered no evidence that any form of clothing impacts on educational standards, nor did she attempt to engage in a discussion with those people like myself who work in areas with high numbers of Muslim students about the impact this statement might have. And she was completely tin-eared as to the effect it might have on the subjects of her statement. At that time, I called it the equivalent of shouting at the Muslim population from across the street. Either Amanda Spielman did not know what impact such a statement might have, or she did not care, and I don't know which is worse. On the flip side of this, I'd argue that Ofsted limitations have been exposed during the pandemic and the various stages of lockdown, when it could have acted as a voice for and worked with education professionals who are going above and beyond their normal work and learning new skills to provide education and care for children and families in the most challenging circumstances. They ducked this responsibility and couldn't wait to get back to routine inspections. So yes, in the NEU, we think it's time for Ofsted to go and for it to be replaced by a system of collaborative support, challenge and accountability, one in which teachers and other education professionals are partners in the process and see it as part of their professional development. Such systems are well developed in other successful countries and were the subject of major research by John Macbeath in Schools Speak for Themselves. Alternatives are also outlined by the Joint General Secretary of my union, Mary Bousted, in her forthcoming book, Support Not Surveillance, where she puts forward alternatives to the inspection system, which are robust, proportionate, collaborative, and fair. That's my contribution to the debate. I look forward to hearing responses and answering any questions. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, so there's a huge amount on the table there. So I'm going to go out for points and observations, questions from the floor. I suppose just two things that I'm sort of trying to get my head around, really. Partly one is the kind of broad historical sweep. So, you know, I went to school in the 70s and the 80s, and I was a student during this whole period where state education was restructured around league tables, exams, and then Ofsted was the kind of last part of that jigsaw. And I just want one thing for us to consider: has the system become better overall for kids during that period? Are fewer kids left behind? Is there less tolerance for failure. And is Ofsted, I'm going to sound a bit sadomasochistic now as a teacher, but is there an element where it is kind of making the system work for kids overall? And is there a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater there? You know, some of the reforms have ensured that fewer kids are left behind. I mean, I remember a lot of kids leaving at 14 and, you know, not being in school anymore when I went to school. So that's just sort of one question. And I suppose that talks to maybe could we have a better Ofsted? And then another one, which I'm trying to get my head around. I thought the Conservatives were going to bring knowledge back in. I thought that was the idea with Gove and company, but there seems to be a new shift in Borisian education policy, which is all about morality and character. And so I'm just interested in that and whether that's actually coming from government. Is there a shift in policy away from knowledge towards a more explicit moralizing and politicizing, maybe a culture wars agenda within education? Or is it that Ofsted is acting independently there as a kind of autonomous institution? I put it in the blurb, a kind of cuckoo institution operating against the intention of the Conservative government that's running the show, or apparently running the show at this moment in time. So hands up, who would like to speak? Alka, would you like to kick us off then?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, great. Thank you. Thank you, all speakers. Some great, lots of food for thought there. I suppose just 2 points really. One on the broader one, and then one I'd like to just take issue with Alex's characterisation on the hijab affair with Ofsted, if it's the one I'm thinking of, the example I'm thinking of. On the broader point, I mean, I in my view, I just think education has probably never been more in such a parlous state as it is today, and that's whatever the exam results or league tables may show. And the reason for that is not just a single body, right? It's not just one factor. It's not just Ofsted. If we think sociologically, we can think of Basil Bernstein saying that exams are really important. The assessment system itself embodies models of what education is and what pupils should be. And I think what we have today is a very reductive and reduced idea of the way people develop, of the kind of that education is fundamentally a relational endeavor and not a question of inputs and outputs. There are things that can be empirically measured, but they're very limited, and you need to be aware of their limitations and use them, I think, very judiciously, rather than the kind of blanket subjective, rather than the blanket subjecting of education and teachers to the data monitoring thing. But I think the flip side of that, and that speaks to your question, Toby, the flip side of all this technology and management by managerialism is that there's been a kind of a real crying out for something ethical, for something moral. And the government coming in with British values just isn't going to cut it, because they've got things on there that aren't even really values. But I think there is a real concern with the a growing thing within, which I see in teachers, where they either intentionally or unintentionally, the distinction between fact, opinion, view, values and beliefs is really blurred. And also the distinction between their political views and their bringing them into the curriculum is also very blurred. And you have increasing number of teachers and unions, I have to say as well, the NEU and others are in on this, of wanting to promote their own political ideas through the curriculum in a way that I think is fundamentally dishonest and is exacerbating this problem, and I think I don't have an instant answer to that, but I think it is something that really does need discussing, because now we've got the two corrosive influences in education, technicism, and then a kind of sort of hyper ethicalization. And what gets lost is that idea of the impartial ground for holding beliefs in bay, to allow children, the younger people who are not yet familiar with thinking abstractly and critically, to induct them into exactly that kind of thinking.
Okay, thank you. Connor.
Can't hear you.
You're muted at the moment, Connor.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, apologies. I might not sound great. I'm just on the tail end of a COVID infection, so I might not sound fantastic. Apologies. Yeah, some interesting points so far. I'm a teacher and union rep in Hackney. I've been in Hackney for 13 years. Just to raise two points or comments. First one is sort of in relation to the idea, is Ofsted political? And I think, general consensus, it's always had some political function. So it shouldn't be a shock, as Alex says, that it's being accused of that now. It's always had that sort of function. The idea that education itself isn't, embedded in ideology is for the birds. My sense of it is that it always has been, and education always has been. Speaking of someone who 14 years Catholic education in Belfast in the 80s and 90s, the idea that there's all of a sudden this moral push. I mean, I was told all sorts of stuff in school, which I think I should have been given an individual independent chance to evaluate myself. But it was, it was rammed down my throat. I had to learn a Hail Mary in 4 different languages. So there you go. My experience as a teacher, speaking to some of the stuff that Joseph mentioned about stress, teacher stress is much less what Joseph talks about fear of saying this or that. And it's much more what Rowenna and Alex outlined. Workload, the high attrition rate, stuff, things like that. And the writer Mark Fisher, who wrote Capitalist Realism, he described his time in FE. And he described his experience of Ofsted as an anxiety that never ends. And that sort of captures what Rowenna was talking about in her experience of teaching. And that's far more the experience you'd get from the average classroom teacher than anything that Joseph outlined. I myself have done 4 Ofsteds. And when I came over from Belfast, we don't have Ofsted there. We have an inspector, but it takes a very different form in Belfast. I didn't really know a lot about Ofsted, but my experience, certainly my early years teaching, was very much to that. So just to say, it's a little bit more what Alex and Rowenna talked about, and a little bit less of what Joseph talked about. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Would anyone else like to come in at that point? If you put your hands up.
Toby, while you're waiting for other people to join, I can't put my hands up because I'm the host, but I've got a comment. If you,
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so when I was thinking about the title of this session, has Ofsted become too political? And I was thinking, well, I'm not actually sure what its political view is, or even if it's a consistent political view. I mean, there is the chief inspector whose views are well known, as we've heard, and then there's the inspectors. There's a lot of them, and I get the sense that they often hold very different views to the chief inspector. Now, I should say I'm not a teacher, but I've been working with teachers for a couple of decades, and the perception I get from hearing them talk about their inspections is that the way an Ofsted inspection goes is often down to the personality and the preoccupations of the particular inspector. Just recently, I had a friend who teaches at a Catholic primary school tell a horror story about an inspection where the inspector came into class, sat down with a group of quite young children and asked them a series of provocative or increasingly provocative questions about their religious beliefs, very, very young children. And this culminated in, what would you say if I told you that Jesus didn't exist? When one of the children gasped out loud, this was later cited as evidence that the school was teaching too narrowly Christian values. The school did complain about this and a couple of other matters, and one of the complaints was upheld. I'm not sure if it was that one, but anyway, the sense they had at the school was that if we'd have had, there was a different inspector went to the Catholic school round the corner, and they got a lovely report. They're doing the same as us. So I sort of recognise the different political tensions and motivations that the speakers have sort of referred to. I think that's all real, but at the end of the day, on the coalface in the classroom, is it the luck of the draw about which inspector you get on the day?
Okay, excellent. I think we've got Holly there, but I mean, I suppose just to try and refine some of the questions, I suppose one of the things we're trying to get our head around is to what extent has Ofsted become an independent political force within the state? Because as Joseph says, that raises all kinds of democratic issues, doesn't it? If they're operating independently in terms of their politics, they ought to be accountable. We are a democracy. So that's maybe, you know, an anxiety around quangos. I suppose the flip side of that is the danger it's become too political, because if it's representing the state in some sense, it's supposed to be to a degree impartial from the, you know, yaboo of ordinary politics and advocating for Conservatives or advocating for Labour and stuff like that. So in that sense, it's representing everybody. It ought to represent everybody's interest and be above kind of immediate partisan politics. So maybe that's kind of one of the issues. I mean, one of the things I feel, and I don't know that it's exclusively an issue of Ofsted, is that the new focus within education policy on questions, I certainly would agree with Neil on this, that there seems to be a focus on the moral and the political, more of an emphasis on that than knowledge. That is highly divisive, because we don't agree on any of those things societally. So when the state starts pushing stuff like that via institutions like Ofsted, that's going to create a hell of a lot of division. Now, I come from politics and morals more from a liberal perspective, and I probably wouldn't agree with an Orthodox, you know, Catholic approach to those issues. And we just don't agree, do we? There is societal division on that. So I think educationalists and regulators and representatives of the state want to be really careful from getting involved in that kind of territory, which are adult disputes in society, ought to be resolved through politics with a, you know, high degree of tolerance, really, for the diversity of views on all of that. Anyway, sorry, I'm talking too much. Holly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. I understand and I agree with the politicization of Ofsted and of schools in general, but I do wonder if we need a counterbalancing political force. And this might fill the teachers with fear, but I mean the kind of American model that we're seeing at the moment with the teachers boards and parents having a say in what's going on, just to counterbalance this kind of top-down pressure of the politicization. In that respect, I think the whole problem of the schools and politicization of institutions fits into our general problem in Britain with the lack of local democracy or outlets for kind of local solutions, and not just local solutions, but just for local input, I suppose, in issues that are really real and close to you.
Excellent. So is
I come back on that, or
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I agree with what you say, Holly, and of course, some schools have that in local education authorities. You know, parents can go, if they're not satisfied with what's happening in a school, they can go to their local councillors, their elected councillors. The one group of schools where they have no recourse to anybody if they're not happy is academy schools and academy trusts, which have no systems of accountability built in. What I would say in answer to some of the questions is, yes, there should be parent input into schooling. Yes, there should be inspection. Yes, there should be moderated inspection, but it should be locally led and led by the needs of local schools, rather than this one top-down, one-size-fits-all model, which I think, I hope people will agree, hasn't addressed the inequalities in our system. It's interesting when you look at, we know that life expectancy and health outcomes in Scotland are worse than they are in England, but we don't blame hospitals where that happens. We know that in areas where poverty is higher, that health outcomes are worse. We don't blame the hospitals. We don't threaten hospitals with closure or being taken over. We look at the needs of communities, and we look at what health services can input to try and address that. Whereas in education, we know that poverty has a big impact. We know that social class has a big impact, but we haven't come up with any answers to address that, because we've become obsessed with measurement and obsessed with monitoring, not addressing that issue. And in answer to Harley's question, I'd say yes, it is sometimes the luck of the draw in which inspectors you get, but more often it's the luck of the draw in where your school is and what sorts of communities it's serving that will determine the way Ofsted inspectors see it, whether that's in an area serving a high Muslim population or an area that schools that are serving families with free school meals and in poorer areas.
Rowena, did you want to come in at that point? Because that was partly talking to some of the things that you were raising earlier.
Yeah, just very briefly.
Yeah.
I just think that the huge issue of social inequality is coming into the classroom and affecting learning outcomes and teaching outcomes is just not very much to do with Ofsted.
Okay, yeah.
I just think it's to do with wider social and economic issues. But just to the Holly's point about the democratization of schools, I do think that that would also be an effective and powerful means of accountability in itself. Like, we do have some schools that are local authority controlled. We do have parent governors, as someone said in the chat. But actually, if you wanted a really radical transformation, couldn't you have a board of schools in which a third is made up of parents, a third is made up of teachers, and a third is made up of the actual owners or the funders of the school? So you had like a genuine balance of interests, and you didn't have just kind of this top-down state technocrat stuff here and then complete powerlessness at the bottom. Like, I think empowering people who have a stake in their local schools to actually have power and control over them would be helpful, regardless of what you think about Ofsted.
In your view, do we need an inspectorate? I mean, or do we just need democratic political control over education?
My feeling is that we need an inspectorate, but you need to take the heat out of it by not making it the only means or one of the very few means of judging a school.
Yeah.
So if you had a variety of ways of evaluating a school, parent voice, teacher voice, you take into account exam results, you take into account a whole wealth of things, then people are less likely to just rely and just be scared about this one inspectorate.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, thank you. Neil, did you want to come in at that point? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of a couple of things. I think there are two discussions taking place at the same time, really, with tonight so far. On the one hand, there's the discussion of whether Ofsted is political, whether it's driven, through sort of a sedate piloted agenda, and then the other discussion is the impact of teaching and learning, and issues to do with workload and whether inspections are that valuable or not. I mean, I think those are all sort of valuable issues to talk about. Coming back to the actual question about political, whether Ofsted is political or not, if I take something that Alex has talked about on a number of occasions in terms of inequality within education and how there's still unequal outcomes and how it impacts on sort of poorer kids, all that is absolutely true. But the question is, if that's the case, why was it after lockdown looking out for transphobia was the #1 priority of Ofsted? There wasn't an issue regarding educational outcomes. Schools had just sort of come out of lockdown. But for them, the #1 issue was homophobia and transphobia, not necessarily on educational outcomes. And I think that's the point I'm making in terms of what are driving Ofsted at the moment. I'll give another example. I mean, something that Toby mentioned, that under the Tories, or at least the coalition governments, the idea of education was to go back to academic rigour, was to go back to more emphasis on curriculum knowledge, and that was part of the GCSE reforms and part of the A-level reforms under Michael Gove. From 2014 onwards, directly after Trojan Horse, whenever Ofsted inspected any schools, the first questions that were asking was, what are your attitudes to homosexuality, which is what happened in a number of sort of faith schools. And so the issue of sort of teaching and learning and teaching strategies was quickly dropped in favour of an ethical agenda. I mean, Al has made some interesting points regarding teaching strategies, and it is the case that Ofsted can be sort of very prescriptive, which has damaged the education system and led to teaching morale being at an all-time low. But equally, at a time when the teaching was supposed to be improving the curriculum, and I think Ofsted did make some good points on that. When it came to inspections, the moral issues sort of took over, and that was considered to be more important than the quality of sort of teaching and learning. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of try to discuss here in terms of what on earth is going on with Ofsted. They actually seem to be less and less interested in teaching and learning and curriculum delivery or poverty or any of those issues. It's a lot of other issues regarding sort of morals. And for want of a better word, woke issue, that seems to be the kind of main issue. And secondly, or finally, the issue of sort of parental autonomy and the issue of undermining parental autonomy is something that schools are under pressure from Ofsted, that they have to demonstrate that kids can actually report behaviour of their parents to a teacher and to a safeguarding officer, right? And that's got nothing to do with teaching and learning. That's in the realm of social work, and it also takes us into the realm of the SNP's Named Persons Act, where every child becomes a ward of the state.
Okay, excellent. Joseph, would you like to come back there? Would you like to, just so we've got all the panel back? If you just unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, just having trouble with that.
Lovely, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to respond briefly to a point that Ian made in the chat regarding, should we be asking, has Ofsted become too religious? And I think this is quite an interesting conversation, because obviously when we're talking about, as Neil was just mentioning, different ideological differences, whether it's sort of more woke beliefs or whether it's religious beliefs, there is a sort of commonality there, which is that most other people aren't going to share your opinion in any given room. And I think this is the problem really with Ofsted, is that they're trying to mandate a one-size-fits-all ideological, cultural, philosophical model rather than an educational model. Education is in itself subjective, because you can teach 3 different people the same thing and they'll come out with different conclusions if they're formed to teach, if they're formed to think properly. And I don't think Ofsted anymore is looking at the way children think or the way children are educated, but rather mandating, as was mentioned earlier, in that sort of top-down approach, what should be taught. And regardless of whether you think that's the correct thing to be taught, that's always going to be an issue, because teachers, parents and children will not always share the same beliefs. So the real question, I think, and the real reason why Ofsted is too politicised is because it's not showing total impartiality to different worldviews. As I mentioned, some schools are being graded down simply because they teach something based on their religion. And that doesn't show any sort of greater level of Islamophobia, Judeophobia, or Christophobia. It's just a pure fact that Ofsted does not like religious teaching. And that may not be the same with every single one of their inspectors. You know, we had the story there earlier where 2 different inspectors gave 2 different opinions on Catholic schools. But the reality is that that's a possibility, and I don't think that should be a possibility if we consider ourselves a nation that prides itself on freedom of speech. So I think that's kind of, to respond to Ian totally, I think we should be looking at whether or not Ofsted is in fact too religious. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Daniel, you've been waiting patiently. Please, your comment.
Thanks very much. I'm a teacher in the Northeast. I teach in a PRU currently, actually. I've only ever really taught in deprived areas. I just want to pick up on really some of the comments about Ofsted's got this sort of overemphasis on woke, that it's too political. It only, you know, it's measuring schools by wokeness, whether it's, you know, how well they're dealing with homophobia and transphobia, or, you know, whatever your position is on whether it should be in schools, you know, anti-racism or whatever. The only thing Ofsted really accurately measures is poverty in an area. You know, if you are in the richest 5%, the richest 5% of children, the most affluent, only 1% of them go to inadequate schools. The poorest 9%. There's a far higher percentage that goes to inadequate schools. In fact, let me correct that. The poorest 5th 9% of them go to inadequate schools. And that's not because rich schools or affluent schools are better at teaching woke. It's because the only real accurate measurements, the only real thing that Ofsted measures is the levels of deprivation in a community. Now, my position is actually as an inspectorate, it's not fit for purpose. We need a supportive, collaborative approach. But the idea that Ofsted's got this overemphasis on woke, I disagree. It has all it really does actually measure is the poverty levels in the community.
Excellent, thank you, Daniel. Alex, did you want to come in there? You're going to have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Really interesting discussion and some great points by all the speakers. I found it really stimulating. I mean, I think, firstly to say maybe it's easier to say that education's become more political, rather than Ofsted, I think, has become more political. I mean, I think as the point's been made, Ofsted's probably been always political. And that's not surprising really as an arm of the state. But I think the other point is that obviously it's done different things or does different things, and yeah, perhaps it's just been pulled into areas that it should otherwise be staying out of. So I think it's helpful to see it as more than one thing. Obviously wanted to say that Amanda Spielman, I mean, she obviously has played a role in standing up for education. In some ways, she's maybe it's a bit of a pushback against what Ofsted had become. It obviously had become part of this accountability and push for exams culture, and she obviously has swung the things back towards knowledge and curriculum to an extent. Although obviously there are plenty of other things going on, but I think we should recognise that she's done better than other leaders of Ofsted. That needs to be said. But I guess my sort of overall, when I look at Ofsted overall and its historical trajectory as we've been discussing tonight, I think what stands out for me is how much I think it parallels or the decline of teacher voice, of teacher professionalism, and has been a part of that. And so overall, it's had a corrosive effect, I think, on teacher professionalism. And for that reason, I like some of the comments about democratization, it being more run as inspection being run more at a local level. So I think we should be exploring things along that line. Was there something else? No, I think I'll leave it there. But as I say, I think it's really, how can we? Well, that was it. That I think it's become more authoritarian than it is an authority, isn't it? And I guess it kind of scares me. I mean, I work in teacher education, and we get inspected too. And it scares me just how much deference there is to Ofsted, and that is something. That's what we need to change. So the question is really, how do we get there? How do we change that?
Yeah, Alex, thank you so much for that. I mean, that's a really interesting issue that you raised there about teacher voice, and because we don't have to sit back and wait to be judged, do we? In the old days, I've heard of these things, teacher centres. There used to be, where people used to do spontaneously in their own time, their own professional development.
Yeah.
In fact, there used to be an exam where you could write the exam yourself and have it validated. I can't remember what it was called. This is pre-GCSE. So it's interesting, that thing of teacher
advisory
voice,
teachers.
Yeah, and how do we get back a sense of agency and working together to raise each other's standards rather than have them raised for us, if that makes sense. We don't have to sit back and wait for things to happen to make things excellent. We can do that. We're professionals, right?
Exactly.
We don't need to be told by other people to do that. And maybe this is the downside of that whole system that was introduced with Thatcher and Major is that it's kind of disempowered people, you know, and kind of separated them from their own professionalism. And we play the game of guessing what the inspector wants and those kind of things. I mean, but there are bits that work, right? I mean, I've had probably my most powerful conversations have been with HMIs, English teachers usually, who've come to look at film studies lessons, who really do know what they're talking about in terms of sequencing, and they're just very experienced practitioners. They really know their stuff, and that's been quite useful. I actually think coursework moderation works quite well. When you get a decent coursework moderator's report, that's a really important part of your own professional development and kind of raising your standards internally. So there's kind of parts of the system maybe that work. But Alistair, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a couple of questions actually, rather than thoughts.
Okay, yeah.
And questions from the point of view of someone who's not a teacher and who doesn't go into schools very often, but kind of takes an interest in what's going on and trying to understand it. So I wanted to go back to the split on the panel, I think, really, in terms of this question of, is it, you know, is teaching too political or not? Because Neil and Joseph very much seem to be pushing the idea that it is, and Rowenna in particular seems to be arguing back against that. So I just kind of wanted to kind of understand that difference, because it seems that, you know, both sides can't be right in a sense. So I guess perhaps this is more directed at Rowenna, but you know, when I speak to people about what they're learning in schools these days, then things that come up regularly are things like a particular view of climate change and environmentalism. Rowenna, you mentioned the Me Too thing, which doesn't often come as a kind of independent stance, but is a kind of loaded one. I see campaigns around things like the problems of critical race theory in schools, or the teaching of white privilege, or a certain view on empire. There's, I know in Scottish schools, drag queens go in and teach the kids poetry or whatever, which is obviously aimed at a certain sort of moral point of view. So that does seem to me to be quite politicized. So Rowenna, I guess my question is, in your experience, are these things just not there? So that's why teaching's non-political, or are they there and you don't see that as a kind of politicization of teaching? So that's one thing, kind of where does the political, the question, is there a consensus on the political question, I suppose is what I'm asking. The second thing is that Joseph in his answer just there mentioned the need to be more impartial. And obviously that's a big word just now because of the report last week and people wanting more impartiality. But I'm not sure if I understand what impartiality is. And I just wonder if someone can reflect a little bit on that, because it seems to me difficult to teach a lot of things from an entirely impartial point of view. So kind of when you say impartial, are you, you know, we can all talk about imparting knowledge, but kind of what does that mean in an impartial sense? Do you risk draining the life out of everything that you're teaching in this desperate bid to become impartial? So how does that work?
Yeah, okay, excellent. Hilary, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a question around, you know, is the real problem that teachers are a bit too cowardly? Is that not the issue? So, you know, if I look at the area I work in, which is pensions, you know, we're regularly challenged by our regulator. And it's really important for professionals to stand up to regulators and question, because regulators clearly have a statutory duty, but, you know, you need to sometimes and say, that's not the only thing that matters. And it kind of feels to me that, you know, if teachers want to be treated as professionals, they need to kind of push back a bit more and argue a bit more against the regulatory intervention in their area in just the same way that we would in other areas. Sorry, Mr.
Doug. Was that the watchdog? SWA.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Perfect, yeah. Just on that last point, I'd say the reason why teachers aren't pushing back is because either half of them have just joined the profession or the other half are thinking of leaving the profession. It's not as simple as let's just push back. I'm a head of department, I've been teaching 10 years, and I have had turnover pretty much every single year as head of department. Teachers are just coming in and out. It's a revolving door.
Yeah.
One of them is Ofsted. In terms of Ofsted being too woke, none of my edicts from SLT have ever been about teaching about transphobia or anything like that. All of those have been something issued by the government, as in attached to lifelong learning, or by my local county council, not by Ofsted. And I suppose my other issue is that when it comes to teachers and Ofsted, the main thing is, yes, it is a constant fear, but it's never actually addressing the issue. It's always a box tick. So, for example, I teach in Hertfordshire, and the latest thing going around Hertfordshire is that we have polish time in our books. So at the end of the lesson, 5 minutes left to go, if a kid has doodled in their books, we're literally encouraging them to paper over those doodles in case Ofsted saw it and saw the child was off task. So we're literally papering over our cracks rather than addressing the issue of why was the child doodling in the first place. So there just doesn't seem to be enough time to sort any of these issues out without a strong voice. But you don't have a strong voice if half the profession is leaving. It's sort of this weird, horrible catch-22, you know? And it's sort of, when I hear about it getting more political, I keep being told that there's so many things I can or can't say. But more often than not, again, because I teach politics, I'm being told I can't criticize government policy because that's too political. That's sort of what I have to say on that.
Thank you. Alka, did you want to come in? And I think I'll bring our panelists back.
Thank you for giving me a second bite of the cherry. I've just noticed in the chat about what teachers pushing back. Somebody said they weren't allowed to speak back when they were given an Ofsted judgment at the meeting, which is pretty outrageous. But that, nonetheless, you would hope that if sort of agree with Hillary's point that a bit more oomph amongst the teachers and they can challenge an Ofsted thing, right? That is possible. And I've known people do that in very difficult circumstances. I think Alistair raised a really important question about impartiality. And I think it's really a not a very well understood concept. And I'm not claiming to say I've got any kind of definitive definition of it, but I think it's not that you teach everything in a dry, desiccated way. And of course, teachers aren't going to drop their personality when they come into the classroom. Your personality, in a way, becomes an important resource, a pedagogical resource partly, as well as your subject and disciplinary knowledge in establishing those kinds of relationships. So it's not about that, but it's about actually the education of the profession itself in being able to tell what the differences are and the different levels of proof needed when you state a fact or an opinion or a belief, and how a fact in the different subjects also has different kinds of proofs, if you like. So what will be proof in a scientific experiment will be different to a better interpretation, say, in a literature class. And then also, so that's within the subject of the official curriculum. But then to know that there's a difference between, if you were starting your lesson or introducing a training session in a school on the assumed belief that Britain, for example, is an institutionally racist country, and not saying anything more, that is just that is the baseline, then that is introducing a belief smuggled in as an assertion, as a truth assertion, and that is what is happening. And I think in many cases it's that people just don't see it as that. They don't know the difference, and other people are probably doing it fairly intentionally because they think that it's sort of for the greater cause, for the cause of justice. It's that they will sort of throw that idea of impartiality out of the window because justice is considered the more pressing concern. But I really disagree. I think if you do that, you're really doing a disservice to your pupils and to the kind of the democrat, the idea of living in a democratic society, because beliefs and values shouldn't be smuggled in like that. There is a value in education, but it's not those kind of political values. The values of education are truth, truthfulness, tolerance, and then the dispositions that you need to teach the subjects, you know, according to those values.
Yeah. I mean, the way I see it is I have political arguments with other adults and I set out to win those arguments. I don't do that with students that I'm teaching. That would be an abuse of power and an act of manipulation. And I think it's extremely dangerous when institutions of the state go down that road, because the state's a powerful institution, and we have a duty of care towards young people in terms of their education. The values are different in that education as they are in the adult political sphere. But Gareth.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to address this point that several people have made now, that that Ofsted isn't coming into my lessons and asking me to, you know, teach woke things, and that, you know, that's may well be the case, but the point is that they will be soon. You know, Ofsted has got a certain trajectory that it's on, and it actually fits a trajectory that many state institutions are following. All sorts of institutions, not necessarily state ones. So, you know, just in a couple of observations, you in your lessons may not be directing your students along any particular, you know, ideological lines because you think Ofsted's encouraging you to do so, but your school definitely is, and your school will not pass an Ofsted inspection if, for example, it's not implementing the sex health and relationships guidance. If it's not implementing that, then it's liable to fail its inspection, or at least it will have another one very shortly afterwards. The same with the prevent process. If it's not seen to be taking part in that with sort of you know, heartily embracing it, then again it's running the risk of failing its inspection. And if you just look at the rapid progress of critical race theory in the UK, which is following to some degree the pattern that it's taken in the States, there are key differences. But in this country, if you look at the kind of schools that Ofsted is saying are outstanding schools, their use and adoption of critical race theory across the curriculum is quite advanced. And, you know, one example of that is decolonising the curriculum. Your school is going to be asked questions, maybe not couched even in the terms of decolonising the curriculum, but the drift of the ideological push that term represents, that drift is coming to your school if it's not there already. And if you look at schools in the UK as a whole, many schools have already gone a long way down that route. So, you know, in summary, I think if you feel that your classroom is inoculated or isolated, or, you know, is in some way not coming into touch with these trends, it's either going on at a level in your school that you're personally not particularly aware of, or this is a trend that you're going to see arriving very soon on your desk, coming with all the force of all the other regulations that Ofsted have been forcing on schools over the past few years.
Excellent. Thank you, Gareth. So, Alex, did you want to come in there? You're going to need to unmute yourself. Alex? Oh, there we go.
Sorry, do you mean me? Because there is an Alex on the panel. I'm not a teacher. Sorry for coming in late on this discussion, but I've found it really amazing. I'm in Madrid, and people's reactions saying, "Oh, well, this is not happening in my classroom. I don't recognise this interference in my classroom." I'm sure that's true, as the last person has just said. The point is not at the moment that it's happening in the classroom, but it is absolutely a discussion. And it's a discussion that's being had between government, unions, and teachers. So I think Gareth was the last person that spoke. It's only a matter of time, really. So as I say, I'm not a teacher. I taught once in a school in Northampton, and it was the worst experience of my life, and never done it again since. So I'm a real fan of teachers. That's a fact. In my school, in my children's school in Madrid, a poster appeared on the outside of the school where we gather before we pick them up, and it says, I won't try it in Spanish, it says, what we have in common is our difference. No, it's not. That's just bad English or Spanish. What we have in common is what we have in common. So that idea of difference permeating the curriculum is certainly happening. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. As far as I can see, it might not be happening specifically to some teachers, and it might not be happening in your particular classroom, but it's definitely a debate and a discussion that is taking place, and it's a worrying one as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I'm going to bring back our speakers for their concluding comments in a minute. But did anyone else want to speak? If you just put your hands up, if you have any final comments or thoughts before I do that, and I'll bring people back in reverse order. Okay, and then Harley's going to have some things to say at the end as well.
Actually, it was before. It was before I was hoping to get to the end.
Oh, okay. No,
before the speakers, yeah.
So go on, Harley. Sorry.
A couple of things. One, responding to Alistair's question, what is impartiality? And also, Toby, you talking about, arguing with your students being a sort of unethical, I think. Well, for me, sort of from my own experience, my model impartial teacher was my sixth form politics teacher, who, we had loads of political arguments, and they were arguments. He challenged everything we thought. He was consistent in that, and we never knew what he thought. We had some sort of hunch based on his personality that he was fairly right-wing. A bit of a prejudice of ours. Turned out years later he was a trade union shop steward. But we never knew. He was consistent in just having a go at us at whatever we thought of, and that was the best teaching experience I ever had. And then Rowenna mentioned, and a couple of other people did as well, I think, democratization, the idea of democratizing this whole thing, bringing in parents, making it more of a community idea about what's important about education. I quite like the idea of that, but I've also got a concern, which I'm not, I said I'm not a teacher, but I am a parent. And as a parent, my experience is that, we've been, parents have been discouraged from taking an interest in the educational values of the schools that my son's been at. And an example would be PTAs, which seem to have been turned into fundraising organisations. But if you want to discuss the approach, the sort of values and philosophy of teaching at the school, really, we're not welcomed in the slightest. And I think there's quite a few teachers think that parents are the problem in education. So I'm sort of flagging that as something we're thinking about debating at a future education forum. So anyway, just to throw those in.
Okay. Anyone else before I bring our speakers back in to solve all of the problems of state education within 1 minute each? Okay. No. Okay. Rowenna.
No pressure. Look, I think there are lots of problems that we've talked about with Ofsted. I don't think the problem with Ofsted is that it's too woke. I mean, Ofsted's job, what it spends its time actually doing, is checking that schools are following the national curriculum. And that's a national curriculum that's been set by a Conservative government, which is increasingly focused, whether rightly or wrongly, on more British history, British values, and actually more knowledge rather than skills. So I don't feel that that's the issue with Ofsted. I think the problem is that it has way too much weight on teachers' minds, and it ends up making them feel frightened and scared, and actually probably makes them poorer teachers, as we've heard from other teachers here. And I do agree, I think it was Hilary who said that we need a little bit more courage in standing up to that. And I think something that's really come out of this discussion tonight that I really appreciate and value is that need to democratize our education system, so accountability doesn't just come from this one technocratic inspectorate, but actually comes from the communities where our kids are learning. And finally, the only thing I'd really add here, and this is really to Daniel's point, who I think said it more eloquently than me, is that for me, Ofsted still is not political enough because it does not take into account the context, the economic and social context and pressures that some schools are under. And it continues to say that some schools are failing because of issues that are way, way beyond their control. And I think that's something that Ofsted, if it was a truly fair and balanced and honest inspectorate, would be able to say fearlessly to the government.
Excellent, thank you for that. Alex.
Yeah, this has been a fantastic meeting. Really enjoyed listening to the contributions and taking part in it. I would start by saying, before the Thatcher government reforms of education, of which Ofsted was one part, the government had two roles in education. One was to ensure that there were enough schools for the pupils that needed to go to school in the areas where they were living. And the second was to make sure there were enough teachers and staff for those schools. Since then, the government has taken on so much more, imposing on schools what should happen in the way some of the people described. And then it needs a watchdog to look over it. So it's just created this top-heavy system that we've all been talking about and trying to unpick today. So teaching isn't impartial, education isn't impartial, because our children are only in school part of the week, part of their lives, and they're bringing in their experiences into the school. So that is going to create a dynamic and a discourse. I think the role of schools is to celebrate the diversity within them and to celebrate inclusion, to celebrate the different races, the different sexes, to challenge sexism, racism, to promote the inclusion of disabled students and so on. But to instill in them, I think what Harvey was talking about, a critical thinking. When you think about how much time our kids spend on the internet and where they get information and news from, I think schools and teachers have a really important role in helping them find a way through that, developing critical thinking skills in the way that Harvey described. So I've been teaching 36 years. I started before Ofsted, and in that time, this is just to reflect on what other people have been saying, we had advisory teachers who were seconded out of school. They didn't leave the school. They were out for a year to go and develop their skills, to work with other teachers in the schools, in teacher centres. Like I think it was you, Toby, didn't you? You talked about teacher centre. There was a dynamic creativity to it that I think is still there in part. You know, I can assure you that most of the teachers I know tonight will right now be working on creating exciting things for their children to be doing tomorrow. It's not all doom and gloom. It is still a fantastic job that people are giving creativity to it. But Ofsted and all the other things that have been talking about are sucking the joy out of it. If you're on Facebook, go to a site called Leave Teaching and Thrive. It's got 50,000, it's only been going a few months. It's got 50,000 members, and it's a community of people where people say, I've just had enough, I can't do this anymore. And people are advising them on what other jobs to do outside. There isn't a shortage of teachers. There's a shortage of teachers who want to still be teaching and be in their job. And you look at some of what people are saying there about the scrutiny, about how judgments are being made about them. And it's heartbreaking. And I think it is an indictment of the current system we've got, where teachers don't have that professional voice, where they're not encouraged to fly, they're not encouraged to take risks, they're not encouraged to think creatively, they're encouraged to do what is needed by the inspectorate, by the system, in a very narrow way. That you asked, how do we unpick it? I don't know, but discussions like this are an important part of it, and I've been really pleased to take part and would happily come back anytime.
Thank you, Alex. Joseph.
Well, thanks for having me, Toby. It's been really interesting to hear a variety of different opinions. I just want to say I totally agree with that point we had from Gareth about creeping ideology, and I think it's a case with a lot of teachers that they're concerned on the inspector who's coming to their classroom, obviously, and not necessarily the office where they're coming from, which is maybe more where that ideology is permeating from. And just to address another person who sort of questioned directly, that's Alistair, I believe. I was sort of concerning more the impartiality of Ofsted itself rather than of teachers. I think Ofsted obviously will come into interaction with a wide variety of different faith schools, of schools of no faith, of different kind of teachers. They need to be the ones being impartial if they want to uphold their credibility. And as I said earlier, I think in conclusion, really at the moment, we're in a situation in culture where there's not really many cultural movements, there's only political ones. Everything is politicized. And I think that's a massive issue. I think that's a massive issue because it means that debate can't be had without us wanting to draw a conclusion. And I think the willingness to offend is a necessary part of conversation, whatever age we are. And I think as soon as the government or anyone else can try and interfere with that right to offend, there's a limitation on the conversation that can be had. And I think, as Amanda Spielman stated, Ofsted is a carriage to implement what the state wants. So when we get mentioned that there are woke edicts coming from the government, it's a case that Ofsted have a duty to try and implement those edicts if they want to continue with their consensus from the government. So I think, as we have in the political structure, we've got good actors and bad actors, but we're always going to criticise the cabinet. So I think it's the same thing with Ofsted. We're always going to have good actors and bad actors, good inspectors, bad inspectors, but we have to criticise the cabinet, or in their case, their leadership. And I think until we do that and we have an independent report into how their leadership actually operates and what kind of ideology they're really trying to permeate through their inspectorate, we're not going to be able to change the system.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Neil. Just unmute. If you just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have. Hang on. Okay. Right. Okay. So you've got a lot of things to sort of take in there. I mean, I tend to agree with Gareth that this is going to be the trajectory that Ofsted is going in, and we keep talking about woke politics, but I think what we're really talking about is instilling identity politics as a kind of belief system. And just to give an example, in my school where I teach, in 2014, we were under requires improvement, and it was nothing to do with teaching and learning. It was the accusation that we're not preparing kids for life in modern Britain, and not enough record keeping of safeguarding, and they completely dismissed our outstanding exam results. Last year, my school was put into special measures due to safeguarding and not enough PHSE lessons preparing kids for life in Britain. They actually said that the quality of teaching and learning is excellent. And you think that's what Ofsted would focus on, but they're not, and they haven't done for a long time. I think we do have to separate out things like, sort of geography teachers getting up, doing an assembly on climate change, critical race theory. And I completely agree with Alka regarding sort of beliefs as facts. And I think Ofsted actually will challenge that. And last week, that has come from the DFE in terms of the importance of sort of facts rather than contested theory. So I think we can sort of separate that out from there. But I think for teachers, we should be allowed to do our job, as other panelists have said. We should be allowed to sort of teach with passion, and it should be about the quality of teaching and intellectual rigor. I'm not necessarily against school inspections. I think school leaders and teachers should be held accountable and responsible for what they do. There's no sort of problem with that. The question is, though, is when it comes to the sort of moral and ethical part that we are expected to sort of pass on regarding identity politics, because that is sort of severely eroding sort of quality of education, and it's eroding what the purpose of it is really of education. I think one final point, which I didn't mention directly in my initial talk, is that you have to remember that Michael Gove, even though he was a big supporter of academic rigor and sort of more challenging exams. He was vehemently against parental rights over their children. And I think it's worth remembering that the woke direction perfectly assists in that undermining of sort of parental authority. And in terms of where this is actually coming from, I actually don't think Ofsted are that independent from the Department for Education. I think it's the case that they just let Ofsted get on doing what they want. So they have a budget of 130 million a year from the government, and that they will be scrutinised. And you have to remember that when it comes to issues on sort of transgender ideology, the Conservative Party are entirely on side with it. The beauty of Ofsted Ed is that older Tory Party voters won't necessarily associate with what's happening in schools with the Tory Party itself. And so that separation of Tory government and woke state sort of continues with Ofsted being a sort of very clear expression of that.
Excellent. Okay, so before we thank our speakers, just a couple of information points. If you've enjoyed this debate tonight, please sign up to the newsletter and you'll be informed about future Education Forum debates. And also, if you'd like to donate some money, that would be fantastic as well. So that's one thing to consider. Also, you might want to have a look at a website called positiveofstedreform.com, which is coordinating some ideas about reform of Ofsted in the future, and one of our speakers has been associated with that. So that's something to have a look at. Harley, did you want to say anything finally?
If I unmute myself, no, I think you've covered it all, Toby. It was really that we keep running events, usually every half term. We're alternating them in person and online debates. So we'll have news about the next one coming up soon. And normally, if we're in person, we like to go to the pub afterwards, and hope you might feel inclined to buy us a pint. But failing that tonight, you might want to donate the price of a pint to the Academy of Ideas for helping put these events on throughout the year. And there's the Education Forum and many other events that run throughout the year. So thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, right, can we thank our speakers, please? Thank you very much, speakers.